You know his face. The silver hair, the calm voice, the man who stands in the middle of hurricanes and war zones and doesn't flinch. Anderson Cooper looks like someone who came from a steady, grounded background, the kind that produces serious, unshakable journalists. He didn't. He came from one of the most extraordinary dynasties in American history. A world of inherited fortunes, social spectacle, public scandal, and private devastation so deep it would have destroyed most people before they ever found their footing. And the remarkable thing, the thing that almost nobody talks about, is that it nearly did destroy him. Not once, twice. This is not the story of a man who coasted on a famous name. This is the story of a man who had to climb out from under one. To understand Anderson Cooper, you have to first understand what the name Vanderbilt actually meant in America. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the original patriarch, built his fortune in the 19th century through steamships and railroads. By his death in 1877, he was the wealthiest man in the United States, wealthier, in relative terms, than almost any individual in American history before or since. His fortune, roughly $100 million at the time, translates to several billion dollars in modern terms. The Vanderbilt name became almost immediately synonymous with American aristocracy. The family built mansions along Fifth Avenue and summer cottages. The word is almost absurd given the scale in Newport, Rhode Island. They threw lavish balls that defined the social season. They collected art, funded institutions, and moved through the world with the absolute assurance of people who had never needed to worry about anything ordinary. And then, with remarkable consistency across generations, they spent it. By the 1970s, the Vanderbilt fortune had been divided, subdivided, dispersed, and depleted. The mansions had been sold off or demolished. The name still opened doors and commanded attention, but the actual financial reality behind it had become something far more complicated than the legend suggested. Anderson Hayes Cooper was born on June 3, 1967 in New York City. His mother was Gloria Vanderbilt, artist, fashion designer, and the most famous member of the family in the 20th century. His father was Wyatt Cooper, a writer from Mississippi who had married Gloria in 1963. Anderson was the younger of their two sons. His brother Carter was born in 1965. From the outside, it looked like the continuation of a grand American story. From the inside, the complications had already begun, long before Anderson was old enough to understand any of them. To understand what Anderson Cooper grew up inside, you need to spend time with his mother's story. Because Gloria Vanderbilt's life, before Anderson was even born, was already one of the most extraordinary and painful American stories of the 20th century. Gloria was born in 1924. Her father, Reginald Vanderbilt, spent money at a rate that alarmed even people accustomed to Vanderbilt's spending, and died in 1925, when Gloria was less than 2 years old, leaving behind substantial debts. Her mother, also named Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, was young, beautiful, and entirely unprepared for the responsibilities of single parenthood. She left her daughter largely in the care of nurses and relatives, while she pursued her own social life in Europe and New York. What happened next became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in American history. In 1934, when Gloria was 10 years old, her paternal aunt Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art, initiated a custody battle to remove Gloria from her mother's care. The trial was covered obsessively by the press. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Newspapers ran daily accounts of testimony that included allegations about the mother's behavior, her social habits, her fitness as a parent. A 10-year-old girl sat at the center of all of it, her private life examined in public by strangers, her future decided by a courtroom rather than by anyone who actually loved her. The press gave her a name during this period, the poor little rich girl. The phrase stuck. It followed her for decades through multiple marriages, through her career as an artist and designer, through every public and private drama of her adult life. She wore it eventually with a kind of wry acceptance, but it never entirely stopped stinging. By the time Anderson was born in 1967, Gloria had already been married 3 times. She was 43 years old and had survived enough to furnish several lifetimes of difficulty. Growing up as Gloria Vanderbilt's son meant growing up inside a particular kind of visibility. The family appeared in the press regularly. Gloria's Vanderbilt jeans line in the late 1970s made her one of the most commercially prominent names in American fashion. But it also meant growing up with a mother whose childhood had been defined by abandonment, public scrutiny, and the wound of having been fought over by adults as though she were a possession rather than a person. That history shaped Gloria in ways that inevitably shaped her sons, whether anyone talked about it directly or not. What happened to the Cooper family in 1978 set the course of Anderson's life, and what it did to him cannot be understood quickly. Wyatt Cooper was by most accounts an exceptional man. Born in Quitman, Mississippi in 1927, he had worked his way into the world of New York letters through talent and persistence alone, as an actor, a writer, a screenwriter. He was thoughtful, warm, and by all indications a genuinely devoted father. He was also, throughout the 1970s, in declining health. Wyatt Cooper suffered from heart disease. By the mid-1970s, his condition had become serious enough that major surgery was considered necessary. In January 1978, he underwent open-heart surgery in New York. He did not survive it. Wyatt Cooper died on January 5, 1978, at the age of 50. Anderson was 10 years old. The loss of a parent at that age is shattering under any circumstances. But the particular circumstances here, the surgical setting, the sudden finality, the fact that his father had walked into an operating room and simply not come back, left a mark on Anderson that he has returned to in interviews and writing throughout his adult life. He has described the period after his father's death as one in which he felt profoundly and persistently that the world was not a safe place, that the people you loved could disappear without warning. That security could be taken away at any moment regardless of what you did or how carefully you tried to hold on to it. What he began to do around this time, almost quietly, was watch the news. It sounds like a small thing, but for Anderson Cooper, it became the door through which he eventually walked out of one world and into another entirely. The television screen offered something his immediate world could not always provide, a sense that the world was larger than any single loss, that stories were being told constantly, that the present moment was always part of something bigger. He was 10 years old, newly fatherless, and quietly beginning to understand what he wanted to do with his life. But before he could get there, something else would happen. Something so devastating it would reshape everything he thought he knew about grief, about family, and about the limits of what a person can survive. Carter Cooper was Anderson's older brother by 2 years. Sensitive, creative, and struggling in the 1980s with emotional difficulties that in retrospect those closest to him recognized as serious, but that at the time were not fully understood or adequately addressed. The language and resources available for mental health in that era were considerably more limited than they are today. On July 22, 1988, Carter Cooper fell from the 14th floor terrace of the family's New York apartment. He was 23 years old. Gloria was present. Anderson was not. Carter's death was connected to the emotional struggles he had been experiencing for years. Anderson was 20 years old and a student at Yale University when the phone call reached him that night. It ended one version of his life and began another. He has said that Carter's death was, in some fundamental way, the event that made him into the person he eventually became. Not because grief is instructive in any simple sense. It is not, but because the experience of it, combined with the loss of his father a decade earlier, created in him a particular relationship with fragility and impermanence that he has carried into every room he has entered since. He has also said something harder to articulate, but that rings true to anyone who has experienced significant loss at a young age, that after Carter died, he felt in a strange way that he had nothing left to lose, not in a reckless sense, in a freeing sense. The worst thing had already happened. Whatever came next, he would face it. Gloria was utterly devastated. She described Carter's death in the years that followed as something from which she never fully recovered. A loss so total and so wrong that it simply could not be accommodated by the ordinary mechanisms of grief. She wrote about it, painted about it, kept Carter present through the decades that followed in every way she could manage, and leaned increasingly on the son she still had. In the early 1990s, Anderson Cooper did something that almost no one from his background would have done. He bought a fake press pass. He was in his mid-20s, recently graduated from Yale, trying to break into journalism at a time when the conventional path, college connections, internships at established outlets, a careful climb up the institutional ladder, felt too slow, too confined, and too disconnected from the world he actually wanted to understand. He could have traded on his name, the Vanderbilt Cooper Connectio. N would have opened doors at almost any media organization in America. He chose not to do that, or at least not primarily. Instead, he fabricated press credentials, flew to Myanmar, and began filming footage of civil unrest there on his own with a small consumer camera. He brought the footage back and sold it to Channel One News, a service that distributed content to schools. Not a prestigious placement, not the kind of debut that gets written up in media columns. But it was real footage from a real conflict, and it got him in the door. What is striking about this period is not the audacity of the fake press pass, though that is striking enough, but what it says about how Anderson Cooper understood his own position. He knew his name was an asset. He also knew, with a clarity not everyone in his situation would have had, that his name was not the same thing as his work. Building something real required the latter, not the former. He spent the early 1990s doing exactly that. He went to Somalia during the famine. He went to Vietnam, to Haiti, to Bosnia, and in 1994 he went to Rwanda. The genocide unfolded over approximately 100 days in the spring and summer of 1994. The images that came out of it, the scale of the killing, the speed of it, the failure of the international community to intervene, were among the most disturbing that a journalist of Cooper's generation would encounter. He was 26 years old, on the ground with his camera, watching something that the formal language of news reporting struggled to contain. What he took from Rwanda, and from the other assignments of that early period, was a reporter's knowledge that the world does not organize itself into comprehensible narratives on its own. You have to go and look. You have to stay long enough to understand what you are actually seeing rather than what you expected when you arrived. By 1995, he had joined ABC News as a correspondent. By the early 2000s, he had moved to CNN, where the trajectory of his career would accelerate dramatically. He was building something real, piece by piece, in the places where the light and the camera were pointed at things that mattered. If there is a single moment that defined Anderson Cooper's public profile, the moment that transformed him from a respected correspondent into something closer to a national figure, it is Hurricane Katrina. In late August 2005, Katrina made landfall along the Gulf Coast. The storm was catastrophic. The failure of response at multiple levels of government unfolded in real time, visibly and devastatingly, on television screens across America. Anderson Cooper was in New Orleans in the water in the streets. There was a moment, widely seen, widely discussed, in which a United States senator appeared on CNN to characterize the relief efforts in a way that struck Cooper as completely disconnected from the reality he had spent days witnessing. He pushed back, firmly, clearly, without hostility, but without deference either. He said on air that what he was seeing in the streets of New Orleans did not match the characterization being offered, and that the people left behind deserved better. It was not a performance of outrage. It was the response of someone who had spent years in places where people suffered, and who knew the gap between official accounts and lived reality was the whole story. People who had been watching the coverage with helpless fury found in that moment something that articulated exactly what they felt. His ratings rose. His profile expanded. He became the host of CNN's flagship program, Anderson Cooper 360 Degrees, and he was careful in the years that followed not to let that moment become a character he simply repeated. He covered Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. He reported from Egypt and Libya during the Arab Spring. In each situation, there was something consistent about how he operated, a willingness to stay close to the human story rather than retreating to the analytical distance that the anchor desk often invites. The closeness was not an accident. It was the product of his own history with loss, layered over years of practice in the field. Then, in 2012, Anderson Cooper came out publicly as gay. He was 44 years old. The statement, shared in an email exchange with journalist Andrew Sullivan, was careful and personal. He had always been comfortable with who he was. The people close to him had always known. His long reluctance to make a public declaration had been rooted in a desire to maintain the separation between his professional role as a journalist, whose presence on screen should not become the story, and his private identity. He also acknowledged that in keeping silent, he had perhaps inadvertently contributed to a kind of quiet that he no longer felt comfortable with. Younger people were navigating their own identities in a more open world, and there was something that felt wrong about a prominent public figure continuing to sidestep the subject when others could not afford to. The response was remarkably calm. The professional identity he had spent 2 decades building was solid enough to absorb the announcement without drama. What had been much less publicly examined was the truth about the money. One of the most persistent myths about Anderson Cooper is that he is wealthy by inheritance, that the Vanderbilt fortune, however diminished, still provided him with a cushion of significant wealth. He has addressed this directly, and the reality is considerably more complicated. Gloria Vanderbilt had made and spent her own money with the same thoroughness that had characterized the Vanderbilt family across generations. Her jeans business had been enormously successful in the late 1970s and early 1980s, but she lived well and spent on the things she valued, and had not accumulated the kind of preserved, invested wealth that the name might have suggested. Anderson has said that his mother told him directly, when he was relatively young, that he should not expect to inherit significant money, not as a warning, as practical information. She understood better than anyone what the name suggested versus what the reality actually was, and she wanted her son to build his life on something real. He has said that this was, in some ways, a gift. The relationship between Anderson Cooper and Gloria Vanderbilt was one of genuine closeness, but also complicated in the ways that relationships between parents and children who have been through significant trauma together are always complicated. They were, for long stretches of his adult life, each other's primary family. Carter was gone. Wyatt was gone. What Anderson and Gloria had was each other, a mother and son who had survived the same losses from different angles and who had found a way to remain close across the decades and the distances. Gloria continued to work well into her old age. She painted, wrote, and remained a vivid cultural presence, someone whom younger people, often discovering her through her son, found surprising in the best possible way. Sharp, funny, and completely unwilling to perform the softened version of herself that old age sometimes invites. In 2016, they made something remarkable together, a documentary called Nothing Left Unsaid, Gloria Vanderbilt and Anderson Cooper. The film was exactly what its title suggests, a long, searching conversation between a mother and her son, covering the full span of Gloria's extraordinary life. The custody battle, the marriages, Carter's death, the money, the name, all of it. Watching it is a strange experience, because what you are seeing is not a performance of family warmth. It is the actual texture of a relationship formed under pressure. They talk to each other the way people talk when they have run out of things to protect each other from directly, sometimes with difficulty, with a kind of love that has been tested enough times it no longer needs to announce itself. Anderson has said that making the documentary was partly motivated by his awareness that Gloria was getting older, and that there were things he wanted to ask, and things she was willing to say, that might not be available forever. He asked, she answered. In June 2019, Gloria Vanderbilt died. She was 95 years old. She had survived a childhood that would have defeated most people, built a creative career on her own terms, endured losses that would have broken many others, and remained to the end completely, unmistakably herself. Anderson was with her when she died. He announced it on air, reading a tribute he had written himself. He was emotional. He was also characteristically precise, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that language is the tool you reach for when what you are trying to express is almost too large for any of them. When the details of Gloria's estate became public, it confirmed what Anderson had been saying for years. The inheritance was not the vast sum the Vanderbilt name implied. The fortune that Cornelius Vanderbilt had assembled in the 19th century had, after more than a century of being divided and diminished, arrived at its final generation in a form very different from its origin. Anderson Cooper is wealthy. What he is wealthy from is his own work, sustained over decades in the rooms where serious journalism happens. He has a family of his own now. His son Wyatt Morgan Cooper was born in April 2020, the name a tribute to his father, a thread of continuity carried forward into a generation that will never meet Wyatt the elder, but will grow up bearing his name. A second son, Sebastian Luke Missani Cooper, was born in February 2022. There is something worth sitting with at the end of this story about what it means to carry a name like Vanderbilt in the 21st century. The name still exists in the world. Vanderbilt University carries it forward in its most visible institutional form. The Newport Mansion is a museum. The Fifth Avenue Mancio NS are gone, demolished long ago. The fortune as a coherent entity does not exist. What exists is the story. And the story, in its full form, is not simply one about railroad barons and gilded excess. It is also the story of a little girl in a courtroom in 1934, a man dying on an operating table in 1978, a young man lost on a terrace in 1988, a son in a hospital room in 2019, saying goodbye to his mother. Anderson Cooper did not escape the Vanderbilt name. He carried it through grief, war zones, hurricane-flooded streets, and long on-air conversations, into a life built entirely on his own terms. What he made of it, no amount of inherited wealth could have produced. It required the other thing: the losses, the drive, the refusal to coast, the decision to go to Myanmar with a fake press pass and find out whether he had anything real to offer the world. He did. The Vanderbilt heir who became his own person did so the only way that actually works, by deciding, early and consistently, that the name was the beginning of the story, not the whole of it. What Anderson Cooper built, nobody can repossess.